We see in the Psalms where it says that the throne of the Lord is made up of righteousness and justice. And we have a spiritual duty that we carry as duty bearers of God's children to take up righteousness and justice. And I love that. Those two words in Hebrew are so beautiful because it's about living out being Christ and Christ-like here on earth for everybody, because they bear the image of God. So righteousness in the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, talks about restoring relationship and honoring them as image bearers in God. And justice, mispat in the Hebrew word, is so beautiful because it's not just about compassion and charity to others and the least of these. It is that, but it's about seeking out the vulnerable to stand with them and correct those things that make them vulnerable and correct the injustice systems. And if we are going to be Christ-like, then we are to do this for everyone who bears the image of God. I think religious persecution goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. We see the Cyrus scroll from the Persian Empire as kind of, this was what was the aspiration for living among people, no matter their faith, and having justice and a restored relationship between them. And yet, I think at every time you can see generations, you can see it in the Bible, where the oppressed, when they rise up out of oppression, ultimately protect themselves and protect their power at the expense of somebody else. And so I think throughout history, this has just been a cycle of human behavior. And unfortunately, I don't think we're exempt from that today. I think it's part of the sin nature in us to want to protect our own, protect ourselves. But in that space, it's where it's just ripe for us to stand up and live a Christ-like life, to be the church to anyone and to everyone. And I think one of the things I love about that word of righteousness in the Bible is that it's actually an ethical standard for us as Christians. And it's calling us to live in a way that is different from our neighbors even, that it shows Christ through our love and through our actions. And what a better way to love your neighbor than through picking up their cause, their concern, and advocating for them. Well, I think as Christians, it's because we're spiritual duty bearers in this space. And I think that the Lord's word is pretty clear about that if you really dig in and wrestle with it. But more than that, as to be Christ-like, it's about restoring relationship, restoring community. And in so many places in the world where persecution exists at a cultural level, they aren't focused on the individual, they're focused on community. And they do life in the community to survive everything. Your community is your doctor, your banker, your market food provider. Your community is so essential, but persecution, no matter the faith, divides that. And the reality is as Christians, we are called to bring restoration, to bring God's kingdom here on earth. And so advocating for anyone who faces this injustice is about restoring relationship. It's about bringing those communities back together. It's an opportunity to be salt and light. Whether they respond to that call in the Lord is on them. But you being Christ-like, they will know us by our love.
But Christians are commanded in Hebrews 13:3, it says, remember those who are persecuted, or remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them, and those who are ill-treated because you're also part of the body. And so it's a command. Just like in the Great Commission in Matthew 28, it's a command verb there, make disciples. Well, it's a command verb, remember, in that Hebrews 13:3. So I think we're disobedient if we don't keep the Great Commission, but I also think we're disobedient if we don't keep the great promise of Hebrews 13 to remember those who are in prison. Another thing for me is, as a Christian and sharing with people around the world, Romans 10 is one of my favorite chapters, where it said, if we confess with our mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Then verse 13, it says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And we go, whoa, that's wonderful. Yes, that's super. But then it goes on and says, how will they call on him whom they've not believed? How will they believe in him whom they've not heard? How will they hear? And this is a preacher. And then verse 17, how faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of the Lord. And so I think if we want to share the hope of Christ around the world, then the world needs to have the freedom to allow this sharing to take place, whether it's the distribution of Bibles or having churches. And so I think as a Christian, it should be a part of our mission strategy to support religious freedom. But religious freedom for people of all faiths is that recognition that God is the creator and that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. And so almost everywhere where Christians are being persecuted, other people are also being persecuted. And so we were in Iraq in January after ISIS had come through the fall. They were there in 2014. That's when they took over the Nineveh Plains. Well, we were there in January 2015. And so we interviewed Christians who were driven out of their homes, but we began to see all of these who were Yazidis who also were there. And so we heard from the stories of Yazidis this week about how women and children would go up on the mountains. Well, they were still up on the mountains when we were there. And some of the women, we were told, jumped off the mountain with their children. Well, how do you leave that without loving them? How do you leave that? We interviewed these two 18-year-old Yazidi girls who had been captured for 100 days and escaped. A horrendous thing happened to them. I can never forget that conversation. I can never forget the look in their eyes. So because we experience the love of Christ, we should also love others as he has told us. And so it's not love other Christians, it's love others, as in the Good Samaritan story, whether they're one of our tribe or not. So I think it's the love of Christ in us that compels us to speak out against injustice, regardless who is the victim of the injustice.
We're created in God's image, every single one of us. We've been implanted in us, within us, something divine that makes us unique. Every single human being. And it doesn't distinguish. He comes for the whole world. When Jesus talks about loving your neighbor, he picks someone who's not a believer as the good example of this. And it tells me that maybe God's scheme has to do with us being open to reaching out to and helping all people regardless. So from a theological point of view, our organization believes that all people are created in the image of God. Christ died for every single human being, and we need to stand up for all human beings, regardless of who they are.
As a person of faith who is not just a person of faith, I live in a country where I have the privilege of freedom, but also I have access to resources, to networks, to relationships. And this privilege is a responsibility for me, for us, to use these resources to support brothers and sisters all over the world when they need to have a voice and they don't have one, and we need to support them. One of the biggest fulfillment in my line of work is when I hear a pastor in a country where they're suffering persecution, and the pastor tells me, Wissam, because of the support, the work, the advocacy that you've been doing, we have been much more capable, much more comfortable in engaging with our own government in our own country, because we know someone has our back. That's part of the Christian unity. It connects back to what is a faith, what is Christian unity, if it's not calling the people who are persecuted, talking to them and saying, how can we support you and serve you with what God gave us? You know, I'm a Baptist, and Baptist history and practice supports freedom of religion or belief for everyone. Because of the history and of the Baptist community, including in the United States. It is the history, but also the theology, the belief that every man and woman are in the image of God, equal. That is why we believe that freedom of religion and belief should be for everyone. Also because we believe that the Holy Spirit works through people and God calls people to himself. So everyone must be free so that when God calls them, they can answer this call. You cannot have one community that has freedom while the other does not. Everyone has to enjoy freedom so that my own community also enjoys freedom.
I think from a personal point of view, I came into this work very much in the Christians speaking out for Christians. And, our name is Christian Solidarity Worldwide, and the organization really was that focus as well. If you're just advocating for Christians, are you really advocating for religious freedom, or are you advocating for privileges for this group? And it was a really tough question. It was a question that I asked myself and the organization asked itself. And we came to a point where we realized if we were going to call ourselves a religious freedom organization, we had to be advocating for everyone. And especially in a country like China, where Christians are suffering. And there's no question that there is persecution of Catholics and Protestants, but the Uyghurs are undergoing a genocide, and they're mostly Muslim. And so it's very difficult to be taken seriously if you're just speaking on this part, but not on the really big elephant in the room. Similar as Burma, you have Christian ethnic nationalities who've been persecuted and targeted for decades. Probably the most severely targeted are the Rohingya Muslims. So as an organization, but also as individuals, we came to that point where we felt that it was our call to speak for everyone. And we found that in a point of faith, and that we believe in a God who allows us to choose him. And we would like everyone to have that choice. And that may mean they don't choose him, but it may mean they do. A colleague of mine who covered Asia was focused on Indonesia, which has a diverse population, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, and Christian. And we had up to that point primarily advocated on behalf of Christians. But we received a case of a young man who was a Muslim who had renounced Islam and become an atheist. And he'd been put in prison for apostasy. And so my colleague, while he was there on a fact-finding visit, he asked permission and was granted permission to go see this young man in prison. And he went in, and the young man said, "Thank you so much for coming to see me, but I think you've made a mistake. I'm not a Christian." And Ben said, "I know." And he said, "Well, but why are you here then?" And my colleague said, "Well, because we believe everyone has the right to choose what they believe." And this young man responded and said, he was really moved. And he said, no Muslims have come to see me. No Buddhists have come to see me. No atheists have come to see me. You're the first person who's come to see me. And I have no idea what happened to that man and his faith. I know that he and my colleague kept in touch for a long time and may still be in touch. But I believe that was part of our witness as Christians, to say, we see your value as a human being, and we affirm your right to choose the path that you're gonna take in terms of your faith. For me, all through the Bible, you see references to speaking out for the oppressed. And it doesn't mention the religion, the foreigner, the alien, which implies those who are not of the same group or faith. I was raised in an evangelical church, but my mother's side are Quakers going back for centuries. And I always really connected with that idea that there is the image of God in everyone, and that there is that we should see that in each person, each individual, no matter their color, their gender, their nationality, their religion. So I think valuing that and affirming that has really informed my work.
Some Christians ask, well, why should I be advocating for other faiths? Well, it's both practical and missional. It's practical because in so many countries around the world, Christians are a minority. And if we act in a way that lifts up the entire community, we're actually ensuring that they have a brighter future where they are. And it's missional because how can people believe in a loving God if they're locked into a prison being tortured every day and the world is silent about their case? We need to step forward into this work confident in our belief in Jesus Christ, but also confident that this is a calling that God places on our heart, that he loves justice. He calls us to love our neighbor, and we're called to respond to that. Their neighbors, their non-Christian neighbors who are suffering for their beliefs, we're called to advocate for everyone. We are called.